And if we can take care of our most vulnerable people, aren't we more spiritually enlightened? Aren't we more whole as a group of people? Aren't we less just talking heads? And so how do we invite ourselves to the actual practicality of what we're talking about? That this isn't just thoughts. These are human lives that are at risk, and there are more coming because of these floods. When I was at COP27, speaking about the food system, I met people whose nations were gone. They're off. They don't exist anymore. They're underwater. This human movement that's coming is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen. It's already started. So how do we practice right now with who we have right now, who's been discarded through our colonial capitalist cosmologies? How do we organize to get them all what they need?
Welcome back to the Sounds of Sand podcast from Science and Nonduality. Today we're offering two conversations from our guest, Dr. Rupa Marya. The first is from January 2023, and it's an excerpt from a Sand community conversation hosted by Sand co-founders Zaya and Maurizio Benazzo. And they discuss Dr. Marya's most recent book, Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. And these community conversations offered to Sand members and the community are a way to connect live with authors and presenters like Dr. Marya. And they're hosted on Zoom, and usually there's a chance to bring and ask your own questions. So you can check out more about our upcoming community conversations on the website scienceandnonduality.com. And just as a reminder, if you would like to donate to Sand and become a Sand member, you can access the archive of previous community conversations with presenters like today's guest, and also people like Bayo Akamalafe, Sophie Strand, and Dr. Gabor Maté. You can find out more on our website about becoming a member. And speaking of Gabor Maté, the second conversation in today's episode is moderated by Gabor, and it's from the Talks on Trauma series from the Wisdom of Trauma launch for the film launch back in 2021. And Dr. Marya is part of a panel of physicians on this one, and the panel is entitled How Trauma Literacy Can Transform Medicine. And Zaya Maurizio will introduce Dr. Marya in the first segment, and again with the full panel of doctors in the second segment. So let's get into today's episode on the Sounds of Sand podcast presented by Science and Nonduality.
Welcome to Science and Nonduality. What is non-duality?
The universal forces.
It's the collective consciousness.
Being aware.
Trauma is not the external event that happens. Trauma is the impact of that event, which is the disconnection from ourselves.
That matter is energy. Energy is matter. That's what EMC squared is about.
There's a language without nouns. There is a language without subjugation. There's a language without objectifying.
But if it's recorded, then there is a collapse. But if it's not, then it's the infinite potentiality.
As a start, we'd like to read a formal bio, just to,
For those who might not know, although I doubt.
Yeah, you probably know.
Yeah.
Rupa Marya is a physician, an activist, a writer, a mother, and a composer. She's a professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she practices and teaches internal medicine. Her works sits at the nexus of climate, health, and racial justice. Dr. Marya founded and directed the Deep Medicine Circle, a woman of color-led organization committed to healing the wounds of colonialism through food, medicine, story, restoration, and learning. She's also a co-founder of the Do No Harm Coalition, a collective of health workers committed to addressing disease through structural change. And she's also a musician and has toured the world with her band, Rupa and the April Fishes. And Rupa, together with Raj Patel, she co-authored the international best-selling book, Inflamed. This is an awesome book, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Justice.
And Rupa, welcome to the Sand community space. Welcome here this afternoon, already afternoon with us.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction.
I'm not sure how many people have read your book, but we thought maybe we'll start by, I love that your book ends by you mentioning your own personal journey. That really touched me. So I thought maybe we'll start this conversation with that, leading towards the content, some of the content in the book. So I was wondering, what was your own journey? What led you from being a medical doctor in a very rigid Western framework of medicine-oriented paradigm led you to this journey to where you are today, to see well-being and illness and disease as part of a web of relations, that the illness and our well-being doesn't reside only in our bodies, but is interwoven with our web of relations.
Yeah, I think that it's something that has been a theme throughout my life. I was born and raised in occupied unceded Ramaytush territory, which is across the bay from where I'm sitting right now. I'm sitting in the occupied unceded territory, Puchin, Ohlone territory. And I was born in what is now called Mountain View, before there were Googles and Facebooks and all that. And my parents were Punjabi immigrants. And my father, when he came to the United States, was studying at the University of New Mexico. He was studying electrical engineering at that time. And when he came here, he was so struck by what happened to the indigenous communities here. Because this area, India, was also colonized by Europeans, but they didn't do the same thing that they did here. And it really pained him. I wouldn't consider my father a radical, but he definitely radicalized me. He definitely opened my mind, because as a child, we were growing up, lower middle class family. Our family vacations consisted of my parents packing us into a VW van and driving around the Western United States. And when we would get to an Indian reservation, my father would always stop the car and ask us to go outside and talk with people and just really have this constant dialogue with us about, look what happened here, look what they did here, and how that contrasted with what happened in India. And so from a young age, I was very just moved and piqued by thinking through what actually happened here. When we went through fourth grade education in California, we learned to make these dioramas of the mission system, but they don't describe the mission system as the site of genocide, of genocidal violence towards the California Native populations. They didn't describe to see what was happening in that way. And so I went through my childhood in this education system a little bit at odds with what I was seeing and hearing from my family and what I was experiencing, what I was seeing and feeling by being just a sentient being in these areas, sitting in oak groves, walking in the bay trees, walking in the redwoods. There's an undeniable presence here in this area that doesn't fit with the strip malls and the highways and the Silicon Valley that we're seeing in front of our eyes. And so it was going through college and growing up with my grandmother, who was a healer in her own way and exposed me to Ayurvedic medicine, and my family exposed me to both of these things. My father was a scientist, but he was also deeply spiritual, and he never saw those things as diametrically opposed in any way. And so I grew up as an artist. I grew up wanting to be a physician, wanting to be a healer. And it was this just insistence about not simplifying my identity, about not making myself convenient to any interpretation, that really created the fertile ground to be able to see the things that I was seeing when I was on the road with my band and touring, and when I was in the hospital at the bedside of patients, starting to notice patterns and starting to notice who was getting sick and how people were getting sick. So that was really, it's been a lifelong journey of noticing patterns and disparities and asking just very naive questions, like, why are things this way? How did they get to be this way? And do they have to be this way? What are other ways that they could be?
Right. Yes. Sorry. So I was wondering, I know this is a huge topic, but what are some of the patterns you started noticing that started opening? And these are, of course, patterns you don't learn in medicine. And as a doctor, you are not trained to see larger patterns than patterns perhaps in the body, and not even that, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think about this work sometimes, about the importance of playing music and having an artistic practice. And I just want to say that because there were periods throughout my medical career where I was playing music 3 hours a day. And it's before I'd wake up and I just play and write. And having a practice like that opens your mind to seeing things in different ways. And my colleagues started to notice it when I was a medical student, like some of the ways that I diagnosed things were a little different. And they'd be like, wait, how did you do that? Or how did you see it that way? And I realized that part of the looseness in my ability to see, or the way I was able to draw connections and let them dissolve and draw other ones, there was a fluidity to thought that I really attributed to music, because that is how I feel, the way my brain feels when I'm writing music. It's also a way my brain feels when I'm meditating or in a ceremony. And so what are these states of our minds that we can access when we give space to our non-flatness of ourselves? And that can influence the way that we do our work in this world, however that work is defined. And so what I started to notice when I was on the road with the band, and I would use the band, we would travel and we'd do these big festivals throughout Europe and the United States and other places. And then what I really like to do was go into these art houses, or to go onto the street, or we were in India, we went to the Tekra slums in Ahmedabad and played with the children there during Diwali. And we're doing a lot of work to see how society and health were interacting. And if I had gone as a researcher with my stethoscope and my clipboard, I would have had a totally different experience. But I went with my guitar, and I went with my bandmates, and I went with music. And then so people interact with you differently. And so all of a sudden you're in someone's home and they're wanting to show you their community. They want to show you and share with you the stories of what's happening in those spaces. And that's really where I started to notice, wow, I'm starting to see these patterns of people who are on the bottom end oppression. And for me, I was starting to notice patterns I'd see in Ireland with communities there that were similar to what I was seeing in India, which was similar to what I was seeing on the Indian reservations and for Native people here in the United States. And that started to coalesce. It's almost like there's like a syndrome of being colonized, where people are overexpressing certain kinds of diseases. So I was calling it for about 5-10 years, like a colonized person syndrome. And then what we come to see in the science over the last 10 years, last decade especially, is that a lot of these diseases that we were noticing were diseases where chronic inflammation was playing a role and playing a role in the onset and development of the disease. And that's where I started looking more carefully with Raj. When I was invited to UT Austin to give a lecture on my work on racism and police violence, because that's what I was really interested in, is how when someone gets shot by the police, and in the United States, it's disproportionately Black and brown people, yes, you can look at that one person who died, but then what's the ripple effect? And what's the ripple effect when there's no justice for that killing? So it's state-sanctioned violence against oppressed communities. And what is the history of policing? And how does it recreate dynamics of power that have been a couple centuries old in these areas? And so as I started looking into that, I started seeing that these disease patterns were repeating. What we're seeing with adverse childhood events, what we're seeing with exposure to police violence, what we're seeing in these different contexts are chronic inflammatory diseases. And so that's where Raj and I, when he heard me give a lecture on this at UT Austin, he says, we have to write a book together. And so that's where we started the journey, the 3-year journey of writing our book, Inflamed.
Yes. Wow. And how does it feel now on the other side of these 3 years? I know when I read your book a year ago, it felt like so new and fresh. And now a year later feels a little bit more like it's become part of our collective conversations. Do you have that feeling as well, that is actually making a movement through our collective?
I'm starting to see more people cognizant of the ways in which trauma and the exposures, the additive exposures, are creating chronic inflammation in the body. And I think that's a really important connection to make, because when you look at the health disparities with Black and brown people in places that are being set along dynamics of white supremacy, such as the United States, you realize that racism is a structure, it's a systemic thing. It's not just someone hurting someone's feelings. It's the reality that certain people's lives are circumscribed to have poor health. You realize that is a form of biological warfare. Then it becomes extremely critical to push back on forms of power that would make that cemented. And so it's been very challenging for me. In the wake of George Floyd, the promises of 2020 never materialized. We've seen the pushback on history being taught both from the right, like we don't even want to talk about critical race theory, let's not even talk about these things, and on the left, where it's let's try to whitewash this narrative a little bit and make it more comfortable and palatable to everybody so we don't actually have to do anything. And that's where on both sides, you can see this lack of wanting to change the actual structures of power. And that's what Raj and I were writing about in the book, is that we're not going to see different health outcomes. We're not going to see the world stop being on fire or flooding, for that matter, until we start changing the power structure. And that's really, that's the seed that we're hoping the book will get enough water and keep sprouting.
And what are some of the power structure changes that you see in medicine that are needed to help our individual and collective well-being, which is interwoven?
I don't think that they are exclusive to medicine. I think that there's a very big, you can't tweak one without tweaking the whole thing. For example, you have to abolish the logic of borders, let's say, in order for people who are here to have access to medicine. So I took care of one of the patients who inspired me to write a whole album and learn Spanish. Este Mundo was a youngish woman in her 50s who felt a lump in her breast and didn't seek medical care for many months. And by the time she came to the hospital, there was cancer everywhere. And when I asked her, when did you feel this? She said, 8 months ago. I'm like, why didn't you come to the doctor? I was so afraid of being deported that I didn't want to be separated from my family. This political reality made it so that this person was alienated from their own sense of what they knew they needed to do for their health. That the physician, the doctor, the medical complex was seen as a part of that violence of a society that polices the movement of bodies. But people have always moved. And now look at climate change. The false notion of nation states and borders is going to make the suffering from human migration even greater than it already is. People are fleeing unreal circumstances, and then they can't even access a space where they can be healthy and safe and take advantage of the abundance that we have to offer as a human species. And so it really is, we could look at medicine. Yes, in medicine, we should probably, get rid of the C-suite, for example, and we should get rid of the for-profit medical industrial complex. We should get rid of pharma having patents. It's insane that we have a vaccine that can make COVID harmless for so many people. And millions of people died in India in spite of that vaccine being available. I lost 20 relatives myself. And that was simply a matter of Western greed. And that's part of the capitalist structures to create manufactured scarcities instead of living in a world of abundance. We have the knowledge, we have the science. Let's use that in service of humanity instead of in service of profit. And so it would have to go through that kind of structure. Can you like decolonize a hospital is a question. Can you decolonize the hospital? No, you can't. You'd have to like really literally burn it to the ground and start with something better, ideally on a farm, right? You'd have to build something a lot better. But should you engage in the struggle of decolonization? Absolutely. Because if you don't, you are tacitly accepting the violences that occur on every day within the medical industrial complex, which is part of the colonial terror project, which has been going on for a couple hundred years.
Wow. It seems like this is the time where we're living in which we see the madness of the paradigm we've accepted as normal. And at the same time, we have to keep some hope. We will not be able to dismantle that monster in our lifetime, but there's something, some steps, some hope that can give us like the balance to see what we need to see and to keep hoping, not just hoping, but making steps for changes. It seems like this is really the energy of this time.
Yeah.
Can we say, this is again a large parallel, but is there any connection you could say that the climate collapse on a global scale shows us also what has happened to us, to our collective well-being? Is the climate collapse a mirror of our collective well-being, which we know is not in a very, we're not in a good shape collectively? Like our youth is struggling with addictions, with suicide, with all of this. How do you?
Yeah, so we talk about that in our book, the connection that indeed that our lack of our broken relationships to one another and to the earth, our broken senses of duties of care to one another and to the earth, to the web of life to which we belong, are the illusion we're living under that we're somehow separate from it or separate from one another, that my health doesn't depend on your actions. This insane public health policy we're seeing coming from the CDC and even from the heads of the institution I work at, UCSF, that, oh, we're just on a you do you phase of a respiratory pandemic. That doesn't exist. Like you can't you do you through a respiratory pandemic. You have to do we do. We keep each other safe. We keep each other well and healthy. And that is not a narrative that is cohesive with the colonial capitalist ideology, which really seeks to emphasize the individual, which atomizes the individual and leaves them shorn of their historical and social context. And that's the way doctors see patients in our medical framework. But in fact, people are part of webs of relationships, and their illness or health is dependent on how those relationships are intact or broken, very directly. And yes, absolutely, we cannot abuse the earth and expect it to show up for us in a way that will be generative of our health and well-being or sanity. And so it is absolutely a wonderful moment to be alive because the diagnosis is very clear. It's screaming at us. The challenge is to awaken in all of us the ability to act collectively, to start moving these power structures.
And of course, this knowledge about well-being extending to all our relationship is a knowledge that any indigenous culture around the world have known for thousands and thousands of years. It's nothing new. It's the reality of modernity, and how we have accepted medicine is due to the past 600 years of the acceptance of scientific model of thinking and rational thought and the individual versus the collective. So it seems like we can't even talk about individual well-being without seeing the full picture, the extended web of relations. So do you see it's possible that one day when I go to a doctor, the doctor will ask me, where do I live? What is my community? How do I celebrate? How do I grieve before they even diagnose me with whatever medical label they give? Do you see that as a possibility? Is this something you hold?
Yeah, I would see that the doctor would know how you do that thing because they're a participant in your community, that you are actually a part of a community in which that doctor, that healer is a participant. So they wouldn't have to ask you because they would know, or they may ask you specific questions, but they would be engaged ideally in, again, a web of relationships within that community to support the health of the whole system. And so it's interesting though, like when I think about what you were saying, I recently had an experience where I went to give a talk at this organic institute, the Rodale Institute, organic agriculture in the United States. And they asked me to talk about my work. And I talked about the history of colonialism interrupting our relationships with each other, relationships with the soil, relationships with the land, with one another. And that when colonial patterns came in and changed the ways we related to each other, changed the way we made our foods, changed the way we practice our medicines, that something was lost, that we are now suffering that we're seeing the outcomes of what happens when those things are lost. And that we need to actually repair those things to have whole systems health, not just health for me as an individual, but health for the ecosystem, health for the ways in which we create our food. you can't, for people talking in the sustainable food movement, they can imagine taking care of the soil while still abusing their workers. There are people who buy organic food to protect the temple of their own individual self, not thinking that, actually, when I buy organic food, it means a farm worker is not going to be exposed to those pesticides. That's why I'm going to buy organic food. I've never really heard anybody say that. And so people do it for themselves. And that's a very interesting, but I gave a talk, and one of the leaders of that institution came to my friend, I don't think he knew he was my friend, and said, why is this person going on about colonialism? Men have always murdered men and raped their women. So to this person, he can imagine the end of violence against soil, but can't imagine a world with no violence towards women. And when I shared this phrase that he said to my friend, Maté Nkemo, who's an indigenous activist of the Waorani people in Ecuador, I'm like, can you believe he said that? He said, this is exactly the problem, is that the mind in the West has been fractured. They don't see that the violence towards the soil is the violence towards women, and that the violence towards women and children is the violence towards the earth, that those things are the same thing. You can't have a world where you dissect these things and think you can do harm to one without harm to all. And so that really is the reunification of the spirit, being, mind mentality that is a hallmark, not just of indigenous cultures, but any culture of sanity. That's a culture of sanity, is understanding that you can't do that. And so it makes me suspect of these organic farming people and these sustainable agriculture people. Like, what are you doing it just to advance a greener capitalism? You can't have a capitalism that's going to take us into a better direction. You have to just set it to the flame and take what's growing in the ashes.
Oh, wow.
And yet, how do we live day to day? We are ourselves, I am colonized. This is all living in me in layers upon layers. And the moment I step outside, I am faced with that reality. How does one walk that path in a way that we can make a difference? And we don't also, how do we begin to heal without the guilt and the shame and the righteousness that we can see emerging as well? It's part of the collective trauma, actually. But what is the balanced way that we start dismantling? And
yes, I think that's a beautiful question. And I don't think I have an answer except to know that it isn't something that one can do alone, that we have to do it together. And that's the beauty of it, that we can't actually we can't unfuck the world by ourselves. And it is actually in the work of collectivity, in the work of mutual aid, in the work of service to the other, whether that's to the soil, whether that's to the person in our community who's sitting on a tarp because our world is so screwed up that we would rather let 6,000 people sit outside in floods and rain than open 30,000 vacant units in Oakland. Just open the door and let the people in. Open the doors and let the people in. And so that is, how do we as people get to the place collectively where we just demand, go to those doors and open those damn doors so the people can come in? What is it about us that we have a prioritized fetish of private property and the rights of private property over the rights of people who are literally sitting in a flood right now down the hill in Oakland or in San Francisco? And so that's what those are the things that I think of most simply. It's not so esoteric. I don't think it's helpful for anyone to wallow in guilt and shame. That's not what this is about. It's more like, how do we put ourselves to service for the healing of these relationships that have been fractured to the point that we can walk past someone and not stop and say, how do we get you into a room? How do we get you safe? And that's not, again, to let our governance off the hook. It's to actually put the heat on.
You mentioned that you're writing also an article for Nature. That's a huge thing that Nature is asking you to write about decolonizing medicine. So there is something. Are you feeling hopeful? How does it feel for you to be asked that? Or do you feel it's just a lip service for something that feels also very fashionable right now, and we're all using that word? And that's also a little scary because it can be another one of the traps, like with the yoga and meditation. Now we have decolonization that we have. Yeah, I think that these places will always try to co-opt and try to be relevant in social movements when they see, especially the young people coming into medicine who want more, want something different. I think that it's challenging to write about decolonizing the medical curriculum, because if I were to design a med school, it would be, first of all, on a farm, and you would not be spending the first year learning anything but the anatomy of injustice, as we outline in our book. The anatomy of how our societies have been created to predispose certain people to health, to take away the autonomy and the voices of our patients, to make people not the experts in their own lives and their own bodies, to situate the dynamics of power in medicine, they are echoing the same colonial dynamics of power, so that they become literate in that, because no one's actually taught that in our society. And once they become literate in that, then you teach them, this is where the spleen is, and this is how this works. And there's a value to Western science. I wouldn't throw it away. I wouldn't say, oh, this is terrible, we got to throw it away. But how do we invite more narratives, invite more science, and invite other ways of knowing and being to create a much more robust,
whole system of knowing with better explanatory power. And that it requires expanding the peers of peer review, that it requires bringing into the fold people with lived knowledge and experience to be our partners and scholars in how we do things, and bringing patients forward to tell us why they're sick. They always know why they're sick.
It seems to me that at the end of the day, what you're saying, it is not even only about medicine. Because if you teach the people who want to become doctor, put them for a year in a farm and explaining all this, they will not even work. Yes, we should do this at every level of school from the first grade to prepare people to be member of society and be able to change every aspect of the society. Because just medicine by itself, apparently, you think, can just medicine itself change? Or...
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That we have to embrace the transformation of our society. It's nothing short of revolution, which is re-examining the ways in which we do things and putting things to the side that don't work and that are actually creating harm and poor health for people.
Yeah. And there is this also dependence that is created on this. What we accepted as a healing today is that you have to go to the doctor, like over and over again. We were filming in the nation, and I would never, this woman, she was working and she knew the healer of the community for many years, and she was assisting him. And she said, he used to see a person one time. He would give the medicine and that's it. She said now she was working in a clinic. I see these files upon files for each patient, and there is no end to the healing, where it didn't used to be like this. The medicine man knew exactly what was needed to this human being at which time, and that was healing. It's the juxtaposition of these two paradigms. Then it's so far apart. Yeah.
So we have a sick care system in the United States. I work in a hospital. I love working where people are very sick. It's my talent. I'm good at taking care of families and patients through severe illness. But when you see how our system works, it's not there to support your wellness. It's like what you're talking about is the supporting of wellness. And when I speak of my friends who live in very almost uncontacted Indigenous context, the medicine is something they interact with every day. It's something that, and it's not just given by a doctor, it's something that you have a relationship with all your different kinds of medicines. Yeah. Coming together in community and having conversation is a kind of a medicine. Grieving, as you mentioned, that's a kind of a medicine. And so there's rituals and there's ways of infusing those things with meaning that are very powerful and very different from how we treat things in a Western context, which is, again, shorn of narrative, shorn of context. It's like you have a protein and a gene and here's your medicine for that. Whereas when you look at COVID, like, why do people get sick in different ways with this bug? What's happening in all these different contexts that the virus is finding itself? Those kinds of things are important.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you.
It's a beautiful place to actually complete our conversation. This is the work of our day. And it's not, I think, if you can spotlight us, Riley, too. And it's not one or the other, and it's not linear, and it's not like we so want to know how, and let's just fix it and move on, right? But no, that's the time is to sit with all of this, not to sit, dance, put fire, all of it, all of this. We are called to embrace all ways of.
One of the things I just want to share that I've been writing about this and thinking about this. There's a moment where when the pandemic hit where I thought, okay, now we're going to get everybody inside. There's 8,000 people outside in San Francisco. Now we're going to do it. And no, we didn't do it. Okay, they opened up some hotel rooms, but the mayor blocked getting everybody inside. So then it was the time of the Delta surge and it was spreading again. People were dying. And then their AQI, the air index, was 460, hazardous to human health. And I thought, okay, now we're going to do it. Now we're not going to just let people languish outside. We have to get them inside. And the reality is we didn't. And in that moment, I was in the hospital and discharging patients who had nowhere to go. And there were more patients coming into the emergency room, so it was impacted. So it was this moment of moral distress where I became an agent of the violence that I abhor, where I had to sign the discharge order to put someone out who had no place to go. And that to me, it is a sign of where we're at as a people, that I had a failure in my own imagination. I reached out to my colleagues. I'm like, can we collectively organize to do something so we don't discharge these patients? They're like, well, we can't because there's all these patients coming in. So the whole system was crumbling. And then you're standing there and you're acting as an agent. And for me, that moment was very painful. It's like when I think about the last 2 years and I really sit with the trauma of my experience as a frontline healthcare provider, that moment was my failure to engage my own imagination about what it means to be in a world I want to see. What does it mean to disobey violence? Because what was being asked upon me was violent to my patient. It was violent to anyone who had to be out in that world, in that air. What was being asked upon me highlighted the violence of the mayor of San Francisco and our complicity as community members here of not demanding that everyone gets inside, right? And so that's where I am just sitting and meditating on that right now. How do I not show up the way in alignment with my values? What does it mean when I don't do that? And what can we do to safeguard ourselves so that when those things happen, as they are right now with this flooding, that we can activate and push? So this is a tremendous community here of people who are like-minded. What is this community doing to activate and push so that those people are safe? And if we can take care of our most vulnerable people, aren't we more spiritually enlightened? Aren't we more in whole as a group of people? Aren't we less just talking heads? And so how do we invite ourselves to the actual practicality of what we're talking about? That this isn't just thoughts. These are human lives that are at risk, and there are more coming because of these floods. When I was at COP27 speaking about the food system, I met people whose nations were gone. They don't exist anymore. They're underwater. This human movement that's coming is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen. It's already started. So how do we practice right now with who we have right now, who's been discarded through our colonial capitalist cosmologies? How do we organize to get them all what they need?
And it's each and every one of us to want to know, because it's people who are released from hospitals, but it's also young people released from foster care. They have nowhere to go. They just turn 18 and they're on the streets. We can't wait for a system to be in place. But if we can help that one young person, that's an act. Yeah, that's a small step, or the same. So it's grim, and yet that's the mood of our time. We have to hold both the grief and the pain, and look for those small steps that we can relieve and care. That's what I love about your book, that the word care, it's there, and care is part of our healing and well-being. And that's what we need to practice, care. That's a spiritual practice, as you say. Yeah.
Going to introduce our next panel, which is on how trauma literacy can actually help us transform the medical paradigm. And we have a wonderful lineup of guest speakers.
Yes.
And the first one is Jeffery Rediger, who is a physician, best-selling author, and a popular speaker. He's an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and the medical director of McLean Adult Psychiatry. Jeffery is a board-certified psychiatrist, and he has also a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. What an amazing combination of degrees. His research on individuals who recovered from incurable illness has been featured widely. And Jeffery's best-selling book title is Cured: Strengthen Your Immune System and Heal Your Life has been widely and loved and appreciated, and it has helped many.
Yeah.
Welcome, Jeffery.
And then we have Dr. Rupa Marya. She is a physician, an activist, a mother, and a composer, an associate professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where she practices and teaches internal medicine. She's a co-founder of the Do No Harm Coalition, a collective of health workers committed to addressing disease through structural change. And she's also part of the Farming is Medicine project, where farmers are recast as ecological stewards of rematriated land, and food is liberated from the market economy. And on top of it, she has toured 29 countries with her band, Rupa and the April Fishes. Thank you, Rupa. Welcome back.
And we have the pleasure to have with us Dr. Wil van Derveer, who is the co-founder of Integrative Psychiatry Institute, which trains doctors to recognize and resolve an expanded spectrum of root causes of mental illness. His clinic in Boulder, Colorado provides integrative psychiatry and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. Emphasizing the role of trauma is a key unrecognized cause of a wide range of human suffering is a central message of his clinical work, due to in part of his personal journey. Welcome, Will.
Yes. And then, last but not least, we have Pamela Wilbe, MD. Dr. Pamela Wilbe is a family physician born into a family of physicians who warned her not to pursue medicine. She soon discovered why. Because to heal her patients, she first had to heal her profession. Fed up with assembly line medicine, Wilbe held town hall meetings inviting citizens to design their own ideal clinic. Open since 2005, Wilbe's clinic, community clinic, has inspired Americans to create ideal clinics nationwide. Pamela is the author of 3 books on physician trauma. Welcome, Pamela. Such a joy.
Everyone.
Welcome, everyone.
Wow, we have 5 MDs for this conversation.
In one room.
I
feel better already. So, Gabor, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good day, good morning, wherever you are. I know we're being watched all across the world. I'm very excited about this panel because we get to look at something very close to my heart, which is both the problems and the possibilities inherent in medical care. And 3 of you I've come to know and actually interviewed for my next book. Rupa, I didn't interview you for my next book only because your book came out after I finished writing my next book, but it's a wonderful book, Inflamed, and I'll be asking you about that. Pamela, I'd like to start with you because, as alluded to in the introduction, you've had quite a personal awakening. And you went through medical school, and then you started practicing medicine, and you became suicidally depressed. And then you had this awakening, which transformed how you practice medicine. And you told me when I interviewed you that in your wildest dreams, you said you never thought that after jumping through all the hoops of medical school, you'll be funneled into 7-minute visits like a widget, treating your people your patients like widgets. So I'm going to ask all of you to be both as eloquent as you all are and as also as brief as you can be. But Pamela, if you can just tell me an encapsulated version of your own awakening and what happened to you in medical school afterwards and how you transformed your practice.
I think I had the dark night of the soul moment after all of that education and realizing that at the end of the rainbow, there was just like you said, a 7-minute visit where I was expected to somehow heal people. I'm definitely one of these holistic, emotional, spiritual healers. And I felt like I was not able to use my gifts with my patients. And then as a result, I ended up suicidal just because of the occupational damage to my psyche. And I thought I was the only suicidal physician in the world until a few years later, when I opened my own practice and ended up at the funeral of the 3rd physician who died by suicide in my town, and come to realize doctors are reported to have the highest suicide rate of any profession, even higher than the military. And by my early 40s, I lost 10 colleagues to suicide, including both the men that I dated in medical school. And these were guys that were successful doctors with wives and children. And it made me ask why? What is going on here? We enter medicine as these idealistic humanitarians. I'm sure all of us here were like that, and hopefully we still are. But then our mental health is on par with our peers when we enter med school, and soon we have 3 times the rate of suicide of our peers. And I guess in summary, as an introduction, I'd just like to say that our work and our working conditions are traumatizing, and they're leading us to occupationally induced PTSD, depression, and suicide. And if we're that wounded, the question is, how can we help others? I never in my wildest dreams thought my patients would be my peers and my colleagues. It's just startling.
Thank you. I'll come back to your experience afterwards because you had this wonderful vision that you've actually realized, and quite an inspiring story of what's possible. Jeff, I remember when I was talking to you first, after I became familiar with your book. By the way, it looks like the subtitle of your book has changed because it's cured. And the subtitle used to do with the science of spontaneous remission. Did they change the subtitles when they brought out the paperback? Is that what happened?
Yes, they did. They changed it to emphasize the problem with chronic inflammation in the immune system.
Okay, I thought it was a great title to start with, but...
Yeah, many people have said that.
Jeff, when I talked to you, you told me that... let me just paraphrase or preface this. The three things that medicine splits. They split the emotions from the physiology. They split the mind and body. They split the individual from their relationship when it looking at illness. And they split everything from the larger social structure. And Jeff, when I first talked to you, you said that to talk about mind-body medicine at Harvard is to jeopardize your career. Those are your words. At least until very recently, you said it's changing. Can you talk about how you became aware of the mind-body dimension to health and what the difficulty is in speaking about it in the medical world?
Yeah, historically, there's always been such a huge chasm between mind and body. And so it was fascinating. Even when I started doing this research, I would find medical reports in the medical literature about these unexplained healings, and doctors would collect some of the medical evidence, but they would never ask what was going on in the person's life. They wouldn't ask, did you make any nutritional changes or psychological changes? Then the psychologists, when they would write about these kinds of reports, they wouldn't look for medical evidence. And so just that piece of it, there is this mind-body chasm, and that's just a little piece of how physicians don't talk to the psychologists historically. The psychologists don't cross the chasm to talk to the physicians. And so we end up with a situation where there's a big misunderstanding. We send people with a medical problem to see the physician, people with a psychological problem to see the psychotherapist, people with a spiritual problem to see the priest, rabbi, imam, or minister. But if we don't all take a step back and look at the bigger picture, or if we don't help patients step back and look at the bigger picture, then we're just working with these pigeonholed problems and don't understand that the power of healing comes from the way these all come together in a lived life. And there's so much we can do to help people activate all of those capacities together at a much higher level than we typically do. And so it's very exciting that now, every day, there's research being done from both sides of that chasm, mind and body, to bring these worlds together. But it takes so long for research to actually change the way medicine and psychotherapy are practiced. So we still have this divide that is too big of a deal. Things are changing, but it's just really slow.
Thank you. So, Bill, that'll take me to you, and for a long time. You founded this institute really to educate psychiatrists. By the way, I hate to say this, but when I hear about somebody being a board-certified psychiatrist, I met a lot of psychiatrists, and I really think a lot of them should be certified. But that's
we specialize in our deficits.
But that's a lot. That's another issue. But Will, you told as much as we know now that so many psychiatric problems, like I'd say, virtually all originate at least origin in trauma. And yet you told me that in your medical education, and I think this is true for all five of us here, the word trauma is barely even mentioned. How did you come to realize the connection between trauma and mental health conditions? And what is in your path to bring that into the medical world?
That's a great question. It's so fascinating that we have our medical hospitals down the road from the psychiatric hospitals.
Jeff, I'm so sorry.
Such a misunderstanding.
Jeff, I'm so sorry, but I was asking Will.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
That's okay. I mean, it's great, but I just want to go around. Okay? So,
I'd love to hear what Jeff has to say about that question, too.
Yeah.
Like Pam, I've had a personal journey, and I think when innovations happen in medicine, I think oftentimes it happens when a person has a personal journey and they're not willing to go along with the dominant paradigm anymore. And physicians who take a stand for mold poisoning typically had a mold personal journey, for example. Mine is more of a trauma journey, and not understanding until well into my 30s that the reason I had so much difficulty in relationship was trauma. Believing that my childhood was a sort of normal childhood. And I did have a lot of privilege. And at the same time, there was incredible adversity and distress. And so the nervous system that I had was very much a trauma nervous system. And for a long time, I thought that going to psychotherapy, which I did a lot of, and learning how to meditate was going to be enough for me to make that journey. But it turned out that that wasn't enough for me. And I needed a deeper way of understanding healing. And that's what led me to your work originally, Gabor, was looking for that deeper way to get underneath what for me is a really hard shell on the outside.
And in your own training, of course, as a psychiatrist, you didn't have much exposure to this trauma perspective, did you?
No. PTSD was what we learned about. And in the training, it was all about, you're a veteran. If you're going to talk about PTSD, you're talking about veterans.
Yeah.
And of course, veterans face incredibly high rates of PTSD, but most of the PTSD we see is not military PTSD. We're talking about childhood trauma. And as you said, none of us had the perspective, none of us knew that trauma is the underpinnings of so many, not just psychiatric concerns, but also physical, medical, long-term chronic disease when the body says no. No, it was completely misunderstood. And I think that there's just a massive dissociation inside of the institution of medicine about our own trauma, about our personal and collective trauma as physicians. And the training system, I was told later, was developed to mimic military training.
Really?
And so that made sense to me because the endless hours, the 24-hour shifts, the things that we learned to tolerate don't make any sense to a person who doesn't have trauma running their nervous system, my opinion.
Let me tell you, you guys as physicians all know what telomeres are. Telomeres for the audience are DNA structures at the end of our chromosome, protect our chromosomes. And the length of our telomeres diminishes with age and with stress. And the more telomere shortening there is, the more disease, the more inflammation there is. They looked at a study of medical residents, students. Their telomeres shorten more in a year than that of their age-related cohort. So that this is medical training. Rupa, you're an MD, you're also a woman of color. What was medical education like for you? And how did you come to realize the larger connections that we're all addressing here between individual illness and broader relationships and social conditions?
Yes, I came to medicine as an artist, as a musician, so I was always very sensitive, and it didn't take long to figure out how traumatizing the medical system was as a medical student. But even before that, just interacting with the medical establishment as a patient myself and seeing how unwhole I felt compared to the Ayurvedic traditions that my grandmother, who was a healer in India, used, and other traditions around the world. And to go back to what Pamela and Jeff were both saying about the mind-body dualism of the Cartesian dualism that is so much a part of Western thought, infects every aspect of our understanding of health and who we are, the self and other, the colonized and the colonizers. And these systems of thought were brought about in a time where medical education was being formalized and Europe was conquering and enslaving and extracting resources from around the world. So this process of stitching these things back together that have been brutally severed, purpose of colonial conquest and establishing capitalist systems of which we are all traumatized by participating in a health system that is specifically capitalist. Not that it's the only traumatizing health system you could be in, but it is highly traumatizing for the practitioners. That those thought patterns were established at that time, 600 years ago. And so to understand why we are facing the levels of burnout that we are facing as physicians, we have to understand how our profession has been complicit with the medics, the missionaries, and the military going together around the world to establish these systems of domination, and that the institutions of our medicine are part of those systems of domination. And any system of domination is going to be inherently traumatizing, not only to the people who are being dominated or invisibilized, whether they're people of color or even our patients, but also to the practitioners who have to enact who have to sever their concern for other humans and other beings in order to participate in that system. And so that's, to me, I see the whole architecture is built on a logic of domination and therefore is inherently traumatizing. So for myself, it was my music that really connected me to keep myself outside of the system as I was going through it. But I was mentioning to my colleagues here just before we started, I'm having Black medical students now approach me at UCSF saying they want to drop out because it's just too traumatizing. Black and Indigenous medical students saying, how do I go through this system that has been clearly set up through white supremacy? And how do I go through it whole without degrading myself? And that is a really hard question for me to answer as their mentor, as a healer, as a professor, because I want to see them achieve and be part of the change. But should they have to sacrifice their own spiritual health or well-being or wellness to do that? And I don't have a clear answer for that. It's something that they are working on, but I do have a clear answer for our need to decolonize medicine. And that is the work that I'm working on in Ohlone territory, what is now called the Bay Area, with several tribal groups, and also in Lakota territory, is reimagining medicine, taking the best of what Western medicine has to offer and rejecting the logic of domination. And understanding where it can be useful and also where it actually is and will always be harmful, and not being afraid to just throw that aside. And so I feel that the work around trauma, Gabor, is probably the most important avenue into this because, as Will mentioned, it touches every aspect of our lives. It's not, I work as a hospital medicine physician where I'll be with a patient who's come in 3 or 4 times within the same month. And finally I'll sit down with them. I'll be like, okay, tell me about your child. Tell me about what happened in your childhood. And invariably there is a story of horrific trauma that has not been digested and composted and integrated. And so how can we just patch people up and send them out and expect them to be doing well when we're sending them out into a world of trauma? And so this is really a critical conversation for us to be having.
Well, thank you. Sorry to interrupt. I want to move the conversation onwards. Thank you for that very articulate, eloquent answer. Jeff, I want to come back to you. So your book, Cured, which I usually have on my shelf here, but I just lent it to a friend of mine with prostate cancer. So I don't have... But you looked at people who, despite the expectations of medical prognoses, either because medical treatment has failed or because they refused medical treatment, but they got better anyway. And you really nailed the point that these are the people we should be studying. Like we just study our own successes or mistakes, but we don't study successes that are outside of our particular comfort zone.
Right.
So, and I thought that your research about how and why people spontaneously overcome terminal diagnoses has a lot to say about why people get sick in the first place. And
it really does. And that's, yeah.
So tell us what you learned there.
And it so parallels your work, Gabor. I quote you all the time for one of the most important findings that I learned from these people after studying them for 18 years. The most important thing that people say when they express gratitude for the illness that they had is that it took an illness for them to wake up and realize that they needed to start taking care of themselves and stop just taking care of everyone else, or just stop responding to the perceived expectations of others. And one of the things that you say that resonates at such a deep level for people, especially when they sit and really let themselves absorb it, is if you don't know how to say no, your body will eventually say no for you. And that is such a profound understanding of how this works for people. 85 to 90% of the illnesses that people suffer from are lifestyle related, whether it's heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune illness, cardiac disease, but we treat them as if they're incurable every day. And in med school, we were taught that these have a genetic basis, and that's as far as the understanding goes. But in the last number of years, we're seeing that genes, yes, they are a basis, but genes are turned on and off by lifestyle at a far higher level than we were taught, most of us in med school, I'm sure. And so even though the people that I study recover from incurable illnesses, if we apply just a portion of what these amazing ultimate achievers did to our illnesses to the lifestyle illnesses that our patients have, we will see a dramatic change in trajectory for these illnesses. And that's why we need to study how people heal. We don't do that. We were taught as physicians to make a diagnosis and start a medication. And at least what I was taught, we don't even study how people heal, which is crazy. So we need to open a new era in medicine.
So what I want to ask you about, before I go to the others, is, and I've talked to people that have overcome supposedly deadly autoimmune disease, sometimes even cancer. This is not a rant against medical care, by the way, or medical miracles, which do exist, but medical practice. But these people that do get better, despite our worst prognostications, I asked you this, and this is my experience as well, the doctors who treat them never asked about, well, how come you got better? Like, what is the reluctance to find out how these people did it? What do you think about that?
Yeah, in 18 years studying individual after individual, I have never yet had a single person say that their doctor expressed curiosity how they got better. The best ones say, whatever you're doing, keep doing it because it's working. But where's the curiosity? We got a whole mystery to a whole wilderness that we haven't mapped yet with this stuff.
So Pam, I'd like to come back to you now. You had the suicidal crisis. You were lying in bed just in full despair. And then you had some kind of a visionary experience, which transformed not just your personal life, but also how you practice medicine. Can you tell us about that?
It was very odd. It was like a prophetic dream. I chose not to go into this too much detail with your earlier question because Maurizio introduced me with such a wonderful introduction about creating these ideal clinics. But this did come to me in half-awakened, dreamlike state where I saw the country transforming and rebuilding the medical system, like firefighters, police officers, doctors, nurses, patients, hand in hand, like rebuilding brick by brick our clinics and our hospitals without these sort of, I guess, no value added intermediaries that have come in to take such a passive income off of our intellect, blood, sweat, and tears as amazing healers, right? And so leaving us with crumbs, time, economics, and everything to try to do the work that we do with patients. So what I did is somehow I felt like I appointed by the universe to lead a series of town hall meetings with the citizens in my community. And so I led 9 town hall meetings. I asked my own patients and community members to design the ideal medical clinic if they could have their dreams come true, make a wish foundation type of thing. And going out on a limb there, because it's not like I had any funding or anything. They could have wanted something that was unaffordable. But what I learned from reading 100 pages of testimony submitted to me over 9 town hall meetings is that all people wanted were things like eye contact, remove the ancillary staff and just sit with me on a couch with some pillows and a beanbag. This is the mind-blowing thing I explain to other doctors, as I've taught about 600 doctors to launch these similar practices. All people really want, because everyone's, what's the secret to a successful practice? All people really want, it's pretty simple, is an answer to their medical problems. That's, whoa, mind-blowing. And then guess what? I know you all have heard, if you spend enough time just listening to the history of the patient will tell you what their problem is and actually explain the whole solution if you just listen and have curiosity, like Jeffery was sharing. And I've been open for 16 years with this practice, actually just retired 7 days ago to go full time and helping other people launch similar practices and also deal with the physician suicide crisis. I feel strange. What's been really strange for me is like being on the phone with a suicidal physician or a mother who lost their only child to suicide in medical school and then getting a phone call for like a thyroid refill or dealing with an ingrown toenail. It's hard to go back and forth from existential crisis and trauma to, and I don't want to minimize the seriousness of a patient who can't walk with an ingrown toenail, but it was too much of a leap back and forth for me. So I'm just dealing with the system trauma. And I feel like by healing physicians from their trauma and helping them launch ideal clinics, thousands of patients will be helped.
What a cop-out. So you went from the difficult problem of curing ingrown toenails to the simple problem of preventing physician suicide. Is that what you did?
Basically, yes. That's what I did. I feel more comfortable here for some reason, maybe because I had a suicidal psychiatrist as a mom. I feel like I've been running a suicide helpline for doctors since I was an embryo. What can I say?
Absolutely. That's true for all of us. Your institute, which you're training for psychiatrists in a trauma-grounded understanding of mental illness. I kind of understand what inspired you to do it, but what actually are you doing there, and what kind of training are you providing, and how's it being received?
It's the most popular part of the program. We cover a wide range of topics from gut-brain connection and gut health, but what people really love is the piece about identifying subtle presentations of trauma and reprogramming the evaluation to look for these signs of trauma. And it does help to answer these unanswered questions, as Pam was saying. If you really listen, you see the clues and you know that it's there. It's not about imposing a trauma narrative on a person. It's more about listening with curiosity, like Jeff was saying. And teaching people how to do that is very exciting because it offers renewal, and it also offers, of course, the personal experience of, do I have trauma? And what was my childhood like? And so there's a deeper inquiry into the humanity of the physician through that process.
Thank you. There was some studies of medical students seem to indicate that they experience their highest level of empathy before they start their training.
Yeah.
It goes down from there.
There's so much shaming in medical training. And I'm curious if the rest of you physicians had this experience in training I had, where you were trained not to, quote unquote, hurt the emergency room by allowing, or not to hurt the ICU by having a patient who got too sick who needed to be transferred to the ICU. And there's this whole culture of, if you were sick, you would work anyway. If you're pregnant, you work anyway. If you had a child who died, you work anyway. Because who's going to take your place if the 24-hour shift isn't covered by you? And there's no room for any inquiry or discussion. And there's no place for discussing what happens when patients die. And what happens when a family is so distressed and you're sent into the room to talk to a family with no training in that. No room. And so it hardens people.
Speaking of hardening, I remember two experiences from medical training. One is in first year medical physiology. And they took these dogs and anesthetized them. And we had to cut them open. And there are these dogs with their open bellies and chests, and their hearts are beating. There was no practical value to that training. We didn't learn anything we couldn't have learned otherwise. In retrospect, what it was really about was making us hardened to our own feelings, and then another thing that I remember is being a medical intern, and the resident in charge of the ward that I worked for would call me at 3 a.m, and it didn't even occur to me that this is how inhumane this is. He would call me about some old person with a stroke in the emergency ward that they want me to go see, who maybe was paralyzed on the left side. And this resident would say to me, there's a 92-year-old dinosaur in ER who can't wave her tail to the left. Wow. This is how I spoke. And I took this perfectly for granted.
Gabor, I just want to share, I have a free gift that's in the series offered to people called Physician Betrayal, How Our Heroes Become Villains. It's purely about my experience standing up against the dog labs. I was the only one in my school of 189 people who was exempted. I actually signed the papers to drop out of medical school over that dehumanizing process, but at the last minute, the dean exempted me from the lab, so I was able to stay. And I was absolutely horrified that nobody else in my class would consider signing a petition to opt out of the lab for philosophical reasons, or even support my right to opt out of the lab. And the reason why is they were fearful for their own future, and they wanted to not get blacklisted from their residency. So I think a lot of times physicians go into a self-betrayal, self-preservation mode, and that prevents us from collectively healing. And certainly once you commit self-betrayal, you're much more likely to betray your patients, your peers, and everyone else, and it becomes a habit.
Absolutely. Rupa, I'd like to return to you now. A wonderful book that just came out a couple of months ago, I think. It really looks at medicine in the context of culture and society and economics and history. And there's some basic statistics that are inescapable, but the profession doesn't seem to draw the lessons. Like women are much more likely to have autoimmune disease than men, but if you're a woman of color, you're even more likely to have autoimmune disease. There's got to be some reasons for that. And your book is entitled Inflamed, and you talk about inflammation. Inflammation is not an individual process. It has to do with the whole system. So can you just briefly summarize the science of how society gets into ourselves?
Yes, this was probably the most exciting thing because I had these hunches as I was touring around the world and working with different communities. And when you go as a doctor to a community, they let you into their homes. You get to see how things work when you go with your guitar as opposed to your stethoscope. And I really got to see how social upheaval and social dynamics were generating inflammatory disease in people disproportionately. I agree, Jeffery, that these things are lifestyle more than genetic. We know with chronic inflammation, but we know that for most brown and black people on planet Earth, lifestyle, and poor people, lifestyle is not a choice. Lifestyle is enforced around us. It's what we have to be experiencing because of the social architecture that has been created through systems of domination. And so health isn't actually even possible. So if you want to tell people to cure their cancer, but they're breathing toxic air from a foundry down the street in East Oakland and they have police killing their children in the streets, those people are never going to be able to heal from cancer, no matter how great their lifestyle can try to be, because there's so much stacked against them. So if we want to see real outcomes in these diseases as physicians, as healers, as people in the medical world, we have to start getting involved in that structural change. So what I saw in the science, which was fascinating, was that the sum of exposures of toxic traumatic exposures, whether they are environmental, chemical, historical, even the stories that we are told as children end up shortening or lengthening our telomeres. That shocked me. So young black boys who have to have the talk about police violence have shorter telomeres than people who don't have to have that talk, or black children who never had that talk. And so I think that for me, what was fascinating was the way that our social histories and lines of power are being translated into the cellular level and generating these pro-inflammatory cell phenotypes, the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. We see those created through the sum of toxic exposures, not simply just a little bit too much radiation, or maybe you got exposed to this pesticide, but actually even histories of intergenerational trauma. And so for me, sitting here in Dene territory, where I'm speaking to you from today, I'm reminded of a study that showed in First Nations in Canada, First Nations people who retained their language, so everything else was controlled for, had lower rates of diabetes. The cultural continuance itself was protective against not only diabetes, but suicidality of First Nations youth. So what is it that the loss of language and the loss of knowing who we are in the world creates an inflammatory milieu in the body that can drive something like diabetes? And we can try to treat that with insulin, but what really needs to happen is people need all the things that have been severed through colonial systems need to be reattached. And that means our relationships to each other, to the entire web of life that supports us through the mind, body, gut, soil axis. All of these things need to be reintegrated, and they have been purposefully deconstructed for nefarious purposes. But we're at a point in history where the earth is suffering and humans are suffering, our societies are suffering from the exact same root causes.
Thank you. Well, let me put you guys all to the test here. Okay, I'm going to start with you. I'm coming to you. I got anxiety. I'm just feeling anxious all the time. Probably sleeping, perhaps. Palpitations, maybe. What kind of questions are you going to ask me?
I think the first thing I would say is, of course, you have anxiety. This is an incredibly anxiety-provoking time to be a human being. And let's cover some territory of different places that can bring anxiety into your life. And so for me, as an integrative provider, I'm thinking about the whole gamut from adverse childhood experiences, which is kind of my pet peeve, pet area, but all the way to how much sugar are you eating? And, what happened, as Rupa said, what happened to your people on this planet? What happened to your ancestors? But it's also the sedentary lifestyle that is a major issue. What medications have you been prescribed? Have you been treated in your life? So it's not a neurotransmitter deficit model. It's more of a biopsychosocial, spiritual model. How disconnected are you? What's happening in COVID? What are you seeing people face to face at all right now? So many different reasons why a person could be anxious and should be anxious.
Right? So The anxiety, what you're here saying is that the anxiety is not an abnormality. It's a normal response to certain life experiences.
Exactly. And it's a doorway into a deeper self-knowing.
Thank you. You mentioned the adverse childhood experiences. Let me tell you guys a story. 3 years ago, the adverse childhood experiences, for those who don't know, are these major studies published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in medical journals around the world, in journals of psychology and so on, were very well known, that show that the more trauma or adversity you experience in childhood, the greater your risk for addiction, mental health issues, autoimmune disease, and so on. And they've been reproduced elsewhere and always with the same findings. So 3 years ago, I was in Norway speaking at a conference. There were 2 other speakers. I will not name them, but if I named them, you would know the names. One of them is a very well-known American psychiatrist. He helped to edit one of the versions of the DSM. The other is a very well-known psychologist in cognitive behavioral therapy. These names would be very well-known to you. I might name them. And I mentioned the adverse childhood experiences to them over dinner. They both said, "What are those?" This is 3 years ago. This is how the split is. Pamela, I come to you with inflamed joints. What kind of questions are you going to ask me?
I'm going to ask about the social fabric of your life, your culture, your religion, what's going on with your marriage, of course, depending on your age. A lot of times, as we all know, as Jeff and Will shared, anxiety, depression, mental health issues are at the forefront of people's chronic pain. And one of the things that I like to do for people, no matter what their illness, is get them into a group visit. I feel like there's a lot of value in creating community. What I've been doing, even in retirement, is bringing my patients and community members into my backyard to sit in circles to process their anxiety that's creating physical issues, particularly around the vaccine and the feuding around the pandemic, because people don't feel safe to even ask questions anymore. They feel like they're going to be in a guillotine with their family members. So almost like a vaccine therapist or a pandemic therapist, allowing people outside of my medical degree to just speak freely and be honored for their opinions, no matter what they are, and to try to get information from other community members in a loving, supportive way. And I feel like that actually has helped people with their physical pain and their headaches, their migraines. People have told me it's been of great benefit. So I would invite you to a group visit, Gabor.
Good, that's fantastic. Sometimes when I give my talks, I ask the audience, raise your hands if in the last 5 years you've been to a oncologist, cardiologist, neurologist, respirologist, dermatologist, any kind of an ologist. So a lot of the audience will put their hands up. And then I'll say, keep your hands up if they ask you about your spousal relationship. Keep your hands up if they ask you about your childhood trauma. Keep your hands up if they ask you about how you feel about yourself. Very few hands there. And I'm taking a liberty in this conversation to say more than I usually in my interviews. Usually I just ask questions, but I really think this is a discussion amongst colleagues. So I'll tell you something else that I came across this week. The New York Times had an article this week about how some American physician has discovered that women with breast cancer who are depressed are more likely to die or die quicker of their disease. And this is like big news, mind-body unity. In 1870, a surgeon called James Paget, in his textbook of surgery, wrote about how depression and breast cancer are connected. It's like we keep discovering the wheel. Jeff, I'm going to come to you next. So you've learned so much from these people that you've studied mainly and so extensively. So when somebody about healing, so when somebody comes to you now with either they have a physical. I know you're not a physician in the sense of working with medical problems, but you work with psychiatric issues. But when people come to you, but often, I imagine you must see people with physical problems, which also has a psychological component. Having learned what you've learned from these people that you've investigated so thoroughly, how does that change your approach to people?
Massively. I was also, I should say, for 14 years, I was the chief at an urban medical center, and I was seeing medical patients. And so at the same time I was doing all this research, I was also seeing psychiatric patients during the day and then medical patients at night. And you start to realize, oh, this is the same thing. The way a person feels about themselves, subconsciously or consciously at a deep level about themselves and the nature of the universe we live in, has a massive amount to do with what shows up in their bodies and how they feel. And so when you sit down and ask a person, do you have stress? And they just start to just tell you, often in a cathartic way, about what's going on. And you start to realize that as a physician, we're taught to actually not pay attention to the story and to eliminate the story, because we are taught to get through to the underlying signs and symptoms of illness that are present in anyone with that particular diagnosis. And so we eliminate the story, and yet the story holds the key to what's really going on. Health is social. Well-being is social. And so whether it's working with psychiatric patients or medical patients, there is so much similarity, and we're missing that story in our medical clinics and hospitals all over the country because we're not asking about what's really going on underneath all this. What is it that's stressful? What is it that's bothering you? What is this really about? And they often, like you were saying, Pamela, people know what's going on, and they just haven't had a chance to say that or to have their words given back to them in a way that they can recognize that they really do know more than they realize.
I've talked to a number of medical people in training as I was writing my next book, and the stories of, they actually took the trouble to listen to people, which, as you say, Jeff, was cathartic for people, and their symptoms actually got better.
Yeah.
But the trainee was criticized for taking too much time with the patient.
Right. Now, my experience is it doesn't take that long to get the story. Because if you're trying to get the story, you can ask questions about the symptoms along the way, but the context is to get the story. And it doesn't take that long, in my experience, if people feel seen and understood. And so that implies something about the need for the person or the physician to receive some attention for development. But if you're trying to get the story and you're really trying to see what's going on, it doesn't take that long. It's just a different context and a different way of approaching the data that you need to get.
Thank you. Rupa, coming back to you again and the larger picture. Your book is titled Inflamed, but the subtitles are always the most beautiful part of a title often. And your subtitle is Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. You've already alluded to some of that, but when you look at a country like the United States, and America is kind of interesting because it sets the standard for the world, so that conditions that burgeon in the United States, we can pretty much know are going to burgeon elsewhere under the impact of globalization, centered around the American model. If you look at the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, and we don't have to go into the economics of it, it's got more chronic disease than almost anywhere in the world. Like something like 60-70% of the population, the adult population, has got at least one chronic diagnosis. And a significant percentage of people, something like 50%, are at least on one medication or another, which is incredible. Yeah. So can you set the social picture for that? It can't be an accident, can it?
No, the outcome of this sickness we're seeing is the outcome of how our world has been structured through colonial capitalism, and all that implies, all that is carried with it, all the stories, all the ways of relating that are toxic that come through those systems, whether it's patriarchy or white supremacy or so many of the isms that we can look at how they structure our bodies and health. And what we talk about in the book with deep medicine is really taking a page from deep ecology. So deep ecology is the understanding that ecosystems can be vibrant and in balance and serving of themselves without being centered around human beings. It's a perspective of ecology that is followed by Indigenous people around the world, that we are a part of a system. We're not the main actors or the center of a system. And deep medicine is the understanding that health can no longer be pursued as on an individual level alone, that we have to start looking at health as an emergent phenomenon of systems interacting with other systems, whether that is social systems, ecological systems, our microbiota, our neural networks, that even the anatomy that we're told is coming from a rigid Enlightenment era fallacy that was used to subjugate the world and other people. So if we need to evolve our understanding as healers in medicine, we have to abandon those thought patterns and really see health as an emergent phenomenon of these systems working together. And that perspective for me is when I do see patients individually, as I do in the hospital. And while I don't love being in hospitals, one thing I love about being in hospitals is that my patients are there for a long time and I can spend as long as I want with them. So if I want to spend 2 hours talking to someone at the end of my shift, at the end of my time, I can spend 2 hours to really go into why is this poor white woman from Alabama here with inflammation throughout her body that no one can figure out. 150 clinicians at UCSF saw this woman in her 50s. She came to us with a diagnosis of lupus. She did not have lupus. She was just totally, completely inflamed. And after her son walks in with white supremacist tattoos around his eyes, 30-something years old, sits at the bedside, I just sat down with both of them. I'm like, where are you from? What is it like where you all are from? Who's getting sick? How are people getting sick? And then the stories of the mercury in the water and the poisoned fish in the Tennessee River Valley watershed. And an hour of listening to these stories, no wonder this woman was inflamed. And I walked out of the room and the son followed me and he collapsed in my arms, sobbing in the ICU. And he said, no one has ever bothered to ask us what our lives are like. And when I think of America right now, the United States, with all these political groups and these factions trying to pit people against each other, when I was holding that sobbing man with proud Bama boy tattoos around his eyes, feeling that connection of I see you, I see what's hurting, I understand, and it's sick and it's wrong. That's where you understand the wisdom of the Black Panthers who are working with poor white folks. That's where you understand the power of politically organizing together to demand an end to the exploitation of our trainees so that we don't have, you're spending too much time with a patient, feedback, but you go and spend as much time as you need to help and heal this person, to help and understand what's happening so that you could be of service to your communities. So the whole system of exploitation of our trainees, the fact that they're paid just abhorrent wages and exploited for this for-profit system to run, it all needs to be reimagined so that we can truly emerge as healers in this work, so that we can do an honor to our communities that we serve and to ourselves. Because like Pamela on the farms, so I'm working to get up farms and to liberate food from the capitalist system for communities. We spend time on the farm in circle, and I call it regenerative medicine. The farmers I work with are doing regenerative farming. I'm like, regenerative medicine is where I'm in circle with you, and we are working through these. Let's talk about diabetes. Let's all talk about it together. It's a very different dynamic than the individualized, atomized, as if we are individuals. Everything about us, even ourselves with the microbiota that we now know, we don't even know what it is to be an individual when our lives are so dependent on millions of other organisms to keep us healthy and well. Even the concept of individualism needs to be reimagined. And I just think it's such a critical moment as climate collapse is intersecting with pandemic, for us to be bold in our articulations and to try to get as many people under the umbrella into the circle as possible.
Thank you. Listen, you guys, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to get a bit technical here for a minute. Will and Rupa, you both mentioned the microbiome, the gut flora. That's something that still kind of eludes me. I do know that it's very much the impact of kind of foods we eat, the environment we live in, also the stresses that we're under, even how we deliver babies, like women who deliver by cesarean section. Their babies will not have as healthy gut flora as children who went through the women's birth canal. Just quickly on this technical of this new science of microbiome, what can you both tell me about that? Just quickly. Well, what did you find out?
The first thing to say about it is that these old friends is what they're referred to, these bacterial strains that, and not just bacteria, but viruses and parasites that we've literally evolved with, take the care to train our immune systems. That's what they do. And if we don't get exposed to them early enough, then the scale is tilted toward chronic inflammation. And that makes us more susceptible to depression, PTSD, schizophrenia, autism, and so forth and so on. So what Rupa is saying is very true, that the breaks in the relationships is this hallmark of disease, right? From healthy soil, the organisms in the soil, to a healthy set of balanced cell lines in the immune system in the gut, to how the bacteria interact with each other in the gut. We have very limited bacterial diversity in our microbiome in our gut, and on the order of about tenfold, according to the American Gut Project, tenfold less diversity than what we need to have healthy immune systems. So we're very much a community. We're a mobile community moving around on legs, and there's more bacterial DNA than there is human DNA in our quote-unquote individual that we are.
Wow.
So what I've seen about the gut microbiome, thank you for that, Will, that was a great explanation, is that if we see inflammation as the body's response to damage, and that's how I understand it, is that it is the body's corrective in the way that the stress response corrects. When there's a stress, you get the activation of these hormones to correct the stress. Inflammation is the way the body's correcting the threat of damage or actual damage to the body. And the microbiota in our skin, in every organ, especially the gut, is involved in modulating that inflammatory response. And the more robust and biodiverse the gut microbiota is, the more protected we are from inflammation. The least biodiverse guts on planet Earth are people who live in the United States in urban environments. Mm-hmm. Most biodiverse guts on planet Earth are indigenous people living with their cultures intact. And those same people have remarkably low, almost negligible rates of chronic inflammatory disease. They don't get cancer. They actually don't get what we call age-associated hypertension, which starts when you send your kids to school in the United States and in modern industrialized countries. 6 years old, you start getting hypertension. They don't have that. Their kids don't get that. They don't have that when they're older. And so it's remarkable because when you lose touch with the biodiversity, and that can happen in one generation, as shown with the colonization of the Irish travelers. So a group of nomadic people were forced into settlement. Their diet did not change. They ate the same exact things, but their lifestyles were forced into settlement from their nomadic lifestyles, which they've had for about 1,000 years. Within 20 years, the gut microbiodiversity decreased. And once you lose those ancestral strains, you cannot get them back. And so that is critical because it shows how the forced colonization, imposing a world order, a worldview on other people, and changing the ways in which they relate to the web of life around them has catastrophic impacts that last for generations. Now, you have scientists at Stanford right now trying to rewild the gut by going and getting Yanomami poop and trying to make a fecal transplant pill. Here, rewild your gut, take this pill. But that shows a deep misunderstanding of what the microbiome is. It is not a pharmaceutical that you can take. It is a living reflection of relationships, of ecological, social relationships with the world around you. And so in order to transform our gut microbiota, we must transform the world around us to support a healthy microbiome, which means everything from eliminating toxic stress like debt, student debt, payday loans, to stopping to damage our soils, eliminating pesticides and the fossil fuel inputs we put on our soils that actually kill the microbiome there, so that our soils become our foods are less nutrient dense. Our soils don't hold as much water. So there's an amazing amount of work that these invisible organisms do for our health.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. Pam and Jeff, I must return to you with sort of a single question. Somebody once said that if you want to create a cult, you separate people from their families, you give them a uniform, a jargon that only they understand, you sleep deprive them, and you put them under authority and leaders. In other words, you send them to medical school. So I want to ask the two of you finally, with this conversation about relationality in mind, how would you like to see medical education? Because as people who have listened so far have gathered, physicians are just not prepared to deal with reality the way it is. So Pam and Jeff, what would you like to see change in medical education?
I'd really like to see us model health. I want to share a quick example of a psych resident who told me that she had only seen her infant daughter for 6 waking hours of her life during the first 6 months of her training. And so that's maternal deprivation. That's going to have long-term effects on the child. And how is she able to do these 28-hour shifts and take care of other people if she's having this sort of disastrous personal life? And I think, Gabor, you mentioned earlier, or no, it was Will, about the military origins of medical medical education, and I did have a medical student in the Army Reserve who told me she was less stressed in Afghanistan during active sniper fire than in medical. Okay.
Wow.
So these are just, I hear from the underbelly. On a suicide helpline, you hear the worst of the worst. I am privileged to really understand what's going on under the radar. And meanwhile, an attending working until his appendix bursts and he collapses, an example of a good work ethic. That's what they're supposed to do. So I guess to answer this question, I think we need to model this, like Marya says, just the food that we eat in hospitals. Like, how about let's not do the French fries and hamburgers. Let's get back to a salad bar. Let's let our doctors and physicians sleep. Like Gabor said earlier, the telomeres, we're aging at 6 times the rate as an intern as the general public, which can be measured on our chromosomes. So I think I've made my point there with some anecdotes. Jeffery, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that we can't give to another what we have not first learned how to give to ourselves. If we don't know how to create well-being for ourselves, if we don't know how to heal our own mental and physical illnesses, then we can't contribute to the healing of others. And so we need to change our medical system so that it can talk about well-being and invest in the well-being and the humanity of the physician. And I can tell you a story about that has to do with my own trauma. As a first-year medical student, my first child was born during semester week at the end of the first semester of medical school. He spent 9 days in the neonatal intensive care unit, and it turns out that he had a part of his brain missing. He had agenesis of the corpus callosum, and the school refused to delay any of my final exams during that period. And I needed to be in the neonatal intensive care unit, and I needed to take those exams, and there was no way to do both, but I had to. So I did. So that 9 days was very traumatic. And that 9 days is when my hair started to fall out, frankly. So that's a bit of the funny piece of it, but that was very traumatic. And that's how we train physicians. Yes, they do steel themselves because they have been traumatized themselves.
And actually, there's been studies on stress and trauma and hair loss. And so your experience wasn't an accident.
No.
But what a terrible story. What a terrible thing to have to go through. Listen, this is a conversation I wish we could beam into every medical school at the beginning of people's trainings. I really wish we could do that. But at least we can say of ourselves that we've learned a few things through our experience, and we're doing our best to transmit what we've learned to other people, and you four certainly are in a major way. So thank you all for this conversation. Zaya, Maurizio, if you'd like to come in now.
Wow, thank you for this transmission. Like, it's the most intuitive thing we all know, and yet it feels like the most revolutionary thing you're saying. That's the sad part. One question that came through is, as a patient, what can I do to help the doctor help me? Like, any advice? Like,
a doctor who is not as aware as you are. Yeah. What can you go?
I think just being direct and asking for what you want is very key. Another thing I just will throw out there very quickly is that thank you letters to doctors have actually prevented suicides. Doctors have told me over and over again, they save every thank you letter from a patient, even if it's 1 or 2 sentences. You literally can save your doctor's life. And when you do that, I just feel like you're creating obviously such a deep relationship, and they're indebted to you. And at its core, it's really a relationship. And the more you can get into that emotional, spiritual, personal context with your doctor, the more your doctor is going to be able to go to bat for you. And so make it personal, make it a real relationship.
I'll tell you what sometimes is, let's face it, modern medicine's got a lot to offer. You know, I've had cataract surgery, and thank God, you know, and that's just a minor miracle compared to what else can be done. At the same time, I tell people, when you go to if you want to buy a birthday cake, do you go to a butcher shop? If you want to buy a steak, do you go to a bakery? No, I don't. Why not? Because they don't sell it there. And I'm saying the same thing with medicine. You go to doctors, go for what they can do. Just don't make the mistake of thinking that what they can do sums up everything that can be done. So you have these needs, and if you can't meet them through the medical system for spiritual connection, for healing your psyche, for seeing the connection between your illness and your traumas, go somewhere where you can get that information. Don't put all your eggs into that medical basket. That's what I tell people often. So not to reject the medical model for what it can do, but not to think that it's in any way complete or as deep as possible. That's my answer to that.
Yeah. A health problem is always more than a health problem. It involves your relationships. It involves how you feel about yourself and the universe you're living in. Yes. And I tell patients they need to, when they see their other doctors, they need to also bring in and recognize that the doctor may have clinical experience or scientific training, but the person themselves also knows a lot about what's going on in their life and in their body and needs to bring all of that to the equation and even be assertive about that.
Yeah.
Wow.
I find it's helpful. I find it's helpful when patients give me books or like this movie. If they say, "Hey, doc, check out this movie or check out this thing," I think that it can be very informative for doctors to learn from their patients. And sometimes it's just someone offering another perspective that can be helpful.
You're suggesting that people educate their doctors.
As they do, because I do believe that patients are the experts, and I think to really claim their expertise in their bodies and in their stories.
And when I looked at Jeff's research, but also my own, the commonest denominator for healing is that people take agency for their experience and for their lives.
Yes.
It's supplements, yoga, meditation, whatever else they do. But the key factor seems to be that they take charge of themselves rather than become passive recipients.
Yeah.
I think I would recommend this movie to your doctor, first of all. It's accessible. And I totally agree with Rupa that books, I've read so many books that my patients have given me, and it's really changed how I practice medicine. So that's a great one. When the Body Says No would be my first one in this vein.
Gee, who wrote that one?
Wow. I totally agree with healthcare as an active experience. When you have a passive experience with a patient, even a payment model in which charity care, I feel like charity care doesn't really work. So what I encourage people to do is donate their time or energy if they don't have money. And so donate to each other. I have a donation basket where patients can share with one another, but still get the care that they need, because often if you're not paying something, of your time, energy, if you don't have money, you don't value what you're receiving. And I don't want anyone to take healthcare for granted as a passive experience.
Wow.
Wow. So much wisdom. Thank you. So beautiful. And actually, we've been contacted already by few medical schools asking us to include the movie in their curriculum. So that is our dream come true. Hopefully more would reach out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you all for your incredible work. So inspiring. Thank you, Gabor. Thank you, Pamela, Rupa, Will, and Jeffery.
Thank you
Thanks for having us.
And thank you for listening to The Sounds of Sand. We invite you to explore more of our talks, dialogues, videos, articles, events, and offerings through our website, scienceandnonduality.com. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please consider becoming a member to access our massive library of SAND content, available exclusively to SAND members. And we would love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify. And share this episode with your family, friends, and all sentient beings. Be well.